just want to introduce Bob Doherty, who's a Professor of Marketing at the Management School at University of York. And his research is obviously fair trade, but the marketing aspects of fair trade and social enterprises. And for example, he's chaired the 4th International Fair Trade Symposium, and what I like about Bob, he does a lot of theoretical stuff and research, but also he's very applied, so what we have to now call impact. So he's given evidence to the House of Commons International Development Select Committee, advisors cooperative group. Must be using a lot of advice at the moment.
Yeah.
And also he chairs the Liverpool Fair Trade Steering Committee. But so he's a all-round great chap. So which is something we'll do. So
good.
Off you go.
Thanks. Hopefully I'll live up to that introduction. Lovely to see you all. And what I'm going to talk to you about, I could talk to you about many different topics, but I'm going to talk to you about the kind of history of fair trade, really, and how it's emerged in the United Kingdom and Europe, and also the pros and cons of recent mainstreaming of fair trade, which I'm sure you will all have opinions on. But I think the other thing that I wanted to say as well, I'm also editor of the Social Enterprise Journal, which is an Emerald journal, and so we do receive a number of papers on fair trade, and so it's quite interesting. I guess fair trade is quite an interesting area because it's a good example of how social movements have created a new market category. You can look at it through that particular lens, and also as a concept, it's quite a hybrid concept. So, fair trade, and I'll talk to you about the history in a moment, really started off with three kind of different objectives: a commercial objective to trade fairly, a social objective to build better livelihoods for producers, but also an education and an advocacy objective as well. So it's very, very much a hybrid. So you think of new market categories and think of hybrids, that will allow you to think about what I'm going to present to you this afternoon. So just a little bit about me. So Will's right, I was originally a practitioner within fair trade. So I had the privilege of spending 5 years from 1998 to 2003 as head of sales and marketing at Divine Chocolate, which when I was a kid I always wanted to work in chocolate, so my kind of dream came true. But it was an interesting journey because Divine is a pioneer. It's a fair trade pioneer, like Cafe Direct, like Tradecraft. They're all what's termed fair trade, FTOs, fair trade organisations, pioneer organisations, and so I'll say a little bit more about that as well. So I've come from practice into academia, so and the reasons for that was to try and make sense of what was going on in fair trade, because really management theory didn't explain how we were able to take a contract off Kraft Jacobs Chouchard with a major supermarket when there was only 3 people in the company, and Kraft Jacobs Chouchard in the United Kingdom employ about 5,000 people. So anyway, let's move on. So just to show you where fair trade has got to, when I say about fair trade, I'm not only going to talk about the fair trade label, the Fairtrade International label. I will talk about other labels, but in the main, this talk is about the history of this particular mark, although I will talk about other marks as well. So if you take this mark, this is the scale. In terms of what we've achieved in this particular social movement, using this mark, this is the level of sales now. It's reached, in 2011, 4.9 billion euros. And if you go back to 1998, it was only about 0.2, it was about 200 million euros. So it just shows you how quickly this market is mainstreamed and developed. I remember when I first started working for Divine, it was really, really difficult to get a meeting with a supermarket buyer. I remember getting my first meeting with Sainsbury's back in 1999. It took me 26 phone calls and about 14 letters just to get my first meeting with them. So it just shows you how far it's come as a market category. So, a little bit about the history. So before I do that, I'll ask you a question, because there's kind of a bit of audience participation here. So I'm not going to spend an amazing amount of time on the earlier history, but I do think it's important to establish where did fair trade start. In terms of modern day, you say since the Second World War, where did fair trade start? Where are the kind of origins and the antecedents of this particular social movement? I know somebody in this room does know the answer to that question, because I can see her smiling at the back. So anybody, any ideas where the literature kind of traces the history recent history since the Second World War? Any ideas?
This is probably wrong, but was it Tradecraft 1979?
Well, tradecraft is part of the story, but even that's a good start, because I will talk about tradecraft and places, people like Artisans du Monde in France, and they were ATOs, alternative trade organisations, before even the term fair trade existed. Yeah, and so fair trade is a kind of a mid-1980s creation, invention as a term, but before that, it was definitely people like tradecraft in the 1970s, and before that, though, you have to go back to the United States of America to really faith-based groups based in the Church of the Brethren, groups like 10,000 Villagers and Serve in the United States. And I'll just show you this lady here, Ruth Edna Byler was her name, and she ran this organisation called 10,000 Villagers. And they dealt with tablecloths and other materials from Puerto Rican refugees, female Puerto Rican refugees, and they took them back to the United States, and they sold them in church halls and churches on a on a Sunday, and that kind of self-help, helping refugees, was the kind of origins of the fair trade movement. And you've got two organisations, Serve and 10,000 Villagers. And then, if you go a little bit further on to the 1950s, can anybody recognise that particular shop? Yeah, it's if you know Balliol College in Oxford, it's right opposite there, and it's the first Oxfam shop. And they had a development programme where they also dealt with refugees in trading, developed a trade programme, an alternative trade programme back in the 1950s, and developed quite rapidly in the early 60s. And this organisation here is Artisans du Monde in France, which is very similar to tradecraft. So you're talking about late 1970s, early 1980s, when these organisations, ATOs, alternative trade organisations, setting up to alleviate poverty, mainly from faith-based origins. But this one's quite interesting. This is one of my favourite organisations, Twin Trading. Now, Twin Trading's got an interesting history. Does anybody know anything about Twin Trading? Anne does, yeah. It's Twin Trading helped to set up Cafe Direct, Divine Chocolate, and Liberation Nuts. The kind of, and it always hides its light under a bushel. It's a kind of untold story within the fair trade movement, and it's got a political history as Twin Trading, because it was at one time embedded within the Greater London Council when Ken Livingstone was the head of the GLC, and it was their international trading kind of policy unit, and they had this. Ken Livingstone had this policy at the GLC that he wanted to create links with all those countries that the West didn't want to trade with, so Nicaragua, Cuba, Vietnam, etc. And when Margaret Thatcher got to find out about this, she wasn't very, very happy. And so it was one of the reasons why she decided to terminate the GLC. But cleverly, Ken Livingstone gave a grant to Twin Trading, which helped them to set up independently. And ever since then, they've done an amazing amount of work with smallholder farmers, smallholder groups around the world, and started off in coffee, then moved on to cocoa, then moved on to tea, moved on to all sorts of different types of nuts, grain nuts, cashew nuts, but do a lot of really, really skilled, interesting work. And they were the original incubator for Cafe Direct, Divine, and Liberation. But it's quite an interesting, and one of the the chair of Twin in the 1980s was a gentleman called Robin Murray, who used to be at the GLC, and his right-hand person was a chap called Michael Barrett Brown. So if you know anything about fair trade and read the fair trade literature, Michael Barrett Brown is kind of one of the, he's 96 now, and I had the privilege of interviewing him last year, and in his little flat in London, and that was really, really interesting. And he told me about how the term fair trade was created, because he stood up in a meeting in 1986, a Twin Trading Conference in Southern Ireland, with all these different people interested in alternative trade, and he said, I'm really, really fed up of international trade, the way the system works at the moment. It's so unfair. What we need is fair trade. And that was in 1986, and that term spread around Europe really, really quickly, and it became the term that people started to use. This is before labelling. This is before certification. And then you had this organisation in Italy called CTM Alta Mercato that set up in 1987, and it still exists today, and they have their own fair trade label. So if you go to Italy, you've got two competing labels. You've got the CTM Alta Mercato label, and you've got the Fairtrade International label. But then, 1989, this is the first ever fair trade label. Sorry, 1988. The first ever fair trade label. And so last year it celebrated its 25th anniversary. And that's the Max Havelaar fair trade label. That's the first certification label, but it was termed the first fair trade label using the term that Michael Barrett Brown had spoke about in 1986. Now, this chap there's two people who were behind setting up this label. This is Nick Roosen, who's Dutch, and also Frank van den Hoff, who was a Dutch missionary working with coffee cooperatives in Mexico, and they were the people who had the idea to set up the first certification label based in the Netherlands, and that's why it's called Max Havelaar. Does anybody know what Max Havelaar, the significance of Max Havelaar? Anybody, any ideas at all? Go on, Anne, you can.
It's a 17th or 18th century novel
Yeah.
about colonialism.
Yeah, it's a Dutch novel. It's a kind of Dutch fictional, it's a kind of famous Dutch fictional character, Max Havelaar. Hence and he was anti-exploitation, anti the colonial practices of the Dutch in Indonesia. So, now, Frank van den Hoff, based in Mexico, was a Dutch missionary, and he was coming under increasing pressure from Mexican coffee cooperatives. This is producer-led, saying that this is okay in Europe, what you're doing. These world shops are selling a certain amount of coffee, but they're not selling enough. What we need is to scale up. We need something different. And hence, people got together and started to think about certification. So when people think certification is kind of northern-led, that's not necessarily the whole of the story, because producers were getting frustrated with the level of growth of particularly coffee cooperatives in Mexico, the level of growth in Europe. So, and this is where we've got to today. So I've talked about the sales figure, but you can see the number of producer organisations that Fairtrade International work with, nearly 1,200, and this is quite interesting. 50% of the board now of Fairtrade International are producer representatives, which is a recent move in the right direction. But you can see the kind of scale. What I'm trying to demonstrate is where it came from. My first couple of slides, was showing you the kind of where it came from, only in the 1990s to where it is, to where it's what's it achieved today. Now, these are all the different certification labels. Go on.
Just a quick one on, just trying to understand what was the scale of market share of fair trade, because I saw the graph going up. I don't know if it's like changed from 1% and it's now 5% or.
Well, I think that's. I think it depends. If you take, I was going to come to that later, but I think it depends by market segment, by country. If you take the United Kingdom, 50% of bagged sugar in the United Kingdom is now fair trade sugar. 60% of bananas sold in the United Kingdom are now fair trade. If you take chocolate, cocoa is 53% of the market now. 823 million sold fair trade sales. But if you look globally, say you looked at coffee globally, it's only 1% of global production. If you add Rainforest Alliance together with all the fair trade labels, UTZ certification in coffee, I'm talking about coffee now, plus some of the other certification, sustainability certification schemes in coffee, it's only about between 4 to 5% of global production. So there's still a big job to do. But I think in terms of some markets like the United Kingdom, it's done reasonably well in certain market segments, but it's got a long way to go globally. So these are all the different labels, and obviously we've spoke about this one. This is mainly in food and drinks and clothing, is the Fairtrade International mark. And then you've got the WFTO mark, World Fair Trade Organization, which is born out of the alternative trade movement and mainly looks at arts and crafts. And I'll show you the sales figure in a moment. And this one is the Italian label I mentioned, Alto Mercato. This is Fairtrade EcoCert. Now this is interesting because EcoCert is originally an organic certifier in France. But then obviously there was a demand in France, particularly in France, for organic and fair trade certification together. That's not been the case in the United Kingdom. But in France there's real demand for the two to be combined. Hence why EcoCert started to move into fair trade certification as well. But EcoCert now have an office in the United States of America and also one in Rio in Brazil, and are starting to develop globally as well as a certification body. This one is Fairtrade USA, which used to be part of this mark, but in 2011 Fairtrade USA splintered from the global, from Fairtrade International. They decided to set up on their own because they want to develop more relationships with hired workers and also plantations. A different philosophy, a different emphasis, whereas Fairtrade International wanted to really focus more, although if you're talking about flowers and some other commodities, it's not always the case, but they wanted to really maintain their priority in terms of smallholder farmers. We can talk about that later. And then Fair for Life is mainly based on ISO standards. And there will be others, and there are others starting to develop. So CLAC, which is an association in Latin America of coffee farmers, have just produced their own fair trade label, smallholder label. And so this what you get is this, people have termed it the labelling crisis. But is it just part of way movements evolve and they start to have different viewpoints and different views on how fair trade should be organised? And there's probably room for other labels in this as well. We can talk about that later. And these are the sales. These are the sales of those labels I showed just before. These are the sales globally. And you can see it adds up to about 6 billion euros in terms of sales. And it's growing. So despite recession, fair trade continues to grow, and if you look at some of the literature recently by Bondi and Talwar in Journal of Business Ethics, they're arguing that the fair trade consumer is a loyal consumer, even in times of recession. So what I just wanted to show you next is per capita consumption by country. Just looking at the fair trade mark, the Fairtrade International mark, just to show you how countries differ. Now, this changes from year to year. Although always at the moment for the past 5 years, Ireland and Switzerland have been at the top. So this is, you take the total amount of sales in that particular country of fair trade mark products and divide it by the population. This is the figure. These are the figures that you get. So Switzerland and Ireland, per capita, have got the highest consumption of fair trade marked products. And then obviously the United Kingdom's quite high. These are on the rise. So the Scandinavian countries are certainly on the rise. Italy, despite having two labels, despite having an original pioneer organisation in CTM Alto Mercato, they've still got a low per capita consumption. The consumer's confused in Italy. It's confused about, and the labels fight against each other. So there's very little collaboration, and it's created a lot of confusion for the consumer. There's a different viewpoint on how fair trade should be organised. We'll come to that later. Now, how the market has developed in Switzerland has been very different to how the market has developed in the United Kingdom in terms of fair trade. Anybody, any ideas the differences? Anybody, any ideas at all? No? Switzerland has mainly developed, it's, in the United Kingdom, you obviously had the alternative trade organisations, and then you had these pioneer social enterprises that entered the mainstream, like Divine, Cafe Direct, Liberation. And then they eventually persuaded the supermarkets and the multinationals to adopt fair trade certification. But in Switzerland, it was the mainstream who were the first entrants into the market. And institutions are different. So in Switzerland, you've got two main retailers, Migros and the Co-op. And they control about 85% of the retail grocery market in Switzerland. And Max Havelaar Switzerland initially went to them and said, would you like to get involved in fair trade? This is back in 1994. And they said, yes, they would. And so the first entrants into the fair trade market in Switzerland were the two main retailers. So it was very much a push strategy rather than a consumer pull strategy, because they converted categories completely to fair trade, not giving the consumer any choice whatsoever. And so it really built the scale and it also is mainly built through bananas, flowers, and bananas and flowers mainly was the two product categories. They didn't look at coffee or chocolate because they didn't want to upset the big institutions locally, people like Nestle and Lindt. Yeah, so very, very different development of fair trade in Switzerland compared to fair trade in the United Kingdom, and hence why you get very different per capita consumption. Now, this is using value chain analysis. So if you look at my fair trade, Where Now for Fair Trade paper in the Journal of Business History, I think it's on the VLE if you want to have a look at it. It's kind of what I'm basing the talk on. In that paper, we use value chain analysis to identify 7 different ways that fair trade products get to market. Yeah, so how do fair trade products eventually end up with the consumer in different consumer distribution channels? The first one is we categorised, and this is building on Darryl Reed's work as well, is the first one, value chain 1, is the social economy value chain. So that is where you might get Cafe Direct sold in an Oxfam shop, or Cafe Direct sold through Tradecraft. It's completely a social economy value chain. Value chain 2 is where you get those original pioneers, those social economy organisations like Divine, Cafe Direct, Liberation, deciding to enter the mainstream retail environment and sell through supermarkets. Value chain 2. Value chain 3 is where, again, these original pioneers decide to supply own label, private label product for the mainstream. So if you take Divine Chocolate, it makes all the chocolate for Starbucks in the UK. So those 3 bars you buy at the counter in Starbucks are made private label by Divine Chocolate. Also, the truly irresistible range of chocolate in the Co-op is made by Divine Chocolate. So it's another value chain. Value chain 4 is where you get the corporation, where it's a corporate-dominated licensing and retailer. So Starbucks is a good example, where it's the licensee holder for its fair trade coffee and it retails its fair trade coffee. Next one is where the Co-op retailer dominated, but it's not the licensee. So if you take Tesco's, it has a fair trade coffee, instant coffee, and it has the fair trade mark on it, but it's not the licensee holder. So it doesn't pay the fair trade fee. It's the third-party supplier that is the third-party contractor that is the licensee holder. So it's the company that always supplied Tesco's with their own label coffee, but now they have they've developed because Tesco's have gone to them and said, we want a fair trade coffee, can you supply it? And they buy the third-party supplier buys the coffee off the fair trade register, packs and makes the coffee product for Tesco's. So Tesco's don't actually sign up to the fair trade standards, but they have Tesco's own label coffee with the fair trade mark on it. That's value chain 5. Value chain 6 is where you get somebody like Cadbury's or Nestle with their Kit Kat, the manufacturer who becomes a Fairtrade licensee and markets that product through the mainstream. And 7 is really your banana value chain, fresh fruit, where you get the corporation and plantation production is another value chain, which we call value chain 7. So you've got 7 value chains bringing Fairtrade products to the market. And this is how Fairtrade is developed. So if you think about what I've already said, and you take the early era, so the 1940s to the late 1980s, we have called this a solidarity era, where you get mainly faith-based groups, non-profits, NGOs, early labelling initiatives like Max Havelaar, and mainly through value chain 1. Yeah, so mainly through the social economy. And then as you get into the 1990s to 2000, you get this early mainstreaming. So you get Fairtrade social enterprises entering the mainstream. You get early Fairtrade licensing initiatives, you know, like the Fairtrade mark, and you get retailers and particularly the co-ops initially entering the Fairtrade market. So you get value chains 2, 3 and 4 starting to emerge in the 1990s to the year 2000. And then, since 2000, you have value chains 5, 6 and 7 that have really come to the fore. And I'm going to show you how that works in a minute. So this is what's happened in recent times. This is the mainstreaming of fair trade. So if you go back to here, where you very much had Tradecraft, Equal Exchange, 10,000 villages, the first ever fair trade certified label, the Max Havelaar label, and you fast forward to today, that's really what's happened. These big mainstream brands adopting fair trade certification. So, how did it all happen in the United Kingdom? So I'm just taking the United Kingdom as a case study, and there's a bit of a poetic license here. So if you take every basket as worth £20 million, what I'm going to show you is how the different value chains have contributed to the development of the UK market. So here we go. So you can see, back in 1998, the UK market was only worth £20 million. When I started working for Divine, it was a real struggle. You know, you can see why. You know, supermarkets didn't know about fair trade. What's this concept, fair trade? Why should we see you? And but this is how it developed. So you got development of value chains too. I'm going to go through it quickly. And by 2005, you're already up to 270 million. Starbucks have started getting interested in fair trade. You've got a Tesco's fair trade roast and grain coffee. 2007, 610 million, and so on and so forth. All the way up to 2011 and 1.4 billion. And now it's about this is out to date. So if you do it to the end of 2013, it's about 1.7 billion because of the impact of fair trade cocoa, Cadbury's Dairy Milk, Kit Kat, all converted to fair trade. That's £823 million by the end of 2013, just in fair trade chocolate. That in the year of 2013. So that's increasing. But so that's the good news. That's the positive part of the story. You've got this development of volume, the scaling up of the market, moving from 20 million in the United Kingdom to 1.7 billion by the end of 2013. But what's happened in terms of the standards, the original fair trade standards? So what I'm going to talk about now is the impact of that mainstreaming on the original fair trade standards, the principles and standards of fair trade. And these were the original 9 principles of fair trade, all the way from fair trade minimum price, social premium, which are different. The fair trade minimum price is a price for each particular commodity. It's the price the farmer gets paid for their raw commodity. And the social premium is an additional element that's paid for community infrastructure projects. It's for funds for community infrastructure projects like, you know, building schools, water wells, roads, bridges, hospitals, whatever the cooperative decides it wants to spend that money on. And it's often paid into a into a trust fund, which is managed by the cooperative, and it's then democratically decided what to do with that particular money. Long-term contracts, direct purchasing, pre-financing. Anybody know what pre-financing is? How does it work? Any thoughts? Yes?
It would mean that producers or whatever Fairtrade certified organisation would receive money maybe before the crop is harvested,
Yeah, exactly.
or at least before it's shipped and
Yeah.
arrives at the other side.
Good. So part of the contract would be that say somebody like Capita Direct or Twin Trading would pay a coffee or a tea cooperative. They would pay them before the harvest, maybe 50% of the contract, because that's when the cash flow is quite tight and a pressure point for farmers. And this was part of the fair trade system, a very good mechanism, very popular mechanism with producer groups, as you can imagine. Sorry, going back there. And these are some of the others. Promote consumer education and sustainable production must be practiced. Now, to be frank, this one here, promote consumer education, really was never enforced. So you had some organisations like Divine and Capita Direct that would do a lot of campaigning. They would do a lot of work in schools on education about fair trade, but certainly not everybody was involved in consumer education. So what's happened, what I'm going to show you now, is what's originally these standards were, these principles were a requirement, but as mainstreaming has developed, they are no longer, some of them are no longer a requirement. So let's see what happened. And some of you will know the story. So really, these three, we are arguing, were never really enforced anyway in the Fair Trade Agreement. So sustainable production must be practiced, consumer education, provision of market information to producers did not always happen, even from the start of Fair Trade International labelling. And then in 2008, the requirement to purchase directly from producer groups was also removed as a requirement. 2008, again, provision of pre-financing is no longer a requirement. It doesn't have to be done. But still, organisations like Cafe Direct and Divine and other organisations like that still do pre-financing. They are very, very strong producer support organisations, but in producer partnership programs, so producer support programs like Cafe Direct have their gold standard, so they invest 50 to 60% of their operating profits every year in supporting their producer partnership programs. But if you just want to adhere to the minimum standards of fair trade, you no longer have to do pre-financing. Might come as a shock or a surprise to some of you, but won't do to the others who research fair trade in the room. And no requirement anymore to have long-term 5, 10, 15-year contracts. So the co-op, for example, for their own label fair trade chocolate, not their truly irresistible range, but their own label standard block chocolate, have the ability to move annually from one producer group to another. And they do that, depending on the price and the supply. So also, again, some other reduction in standards around plantations, which we know around flowers and other products, and no longer a kind of strict requirement just to deal with democratic structures and smallholder farmers in the system. So, what do people think to that? So as fair trade mainstreamed, you've got this reduction in the adherence to the original principles and standards of fair trade. Yeah.
Who decided on scrapping all that?
Well, it would have been Fairtrade International in discussion with the corporations, because what do people think? I think this is quite interesting, because we always used to campaign in the 1990s. We always used to campaign for corporations to adopt fair trade, and when we used to go to public events and speak about fair trade, people would say, "When can we buy it in Tesco's? When can we buy Divine Chocolate in Tesco's? When can we buy it in Sainsbury's?" You know, it was And so when you got your product into those places, it was a big thing. Your sales suddenly doubled within a few months, because unfortunately, if you take chocolate consumption in the UK, 73% of it is bought in just 5 major supermarkets. So you couldn't really build a business model. You struggle to build a fair trade chocolate business if you just develop that business through value chain 1. You'd really struggle. It wouldn't be viable. You wouldn't be able to build a volume.
Would you say that the fair trade label is now kind of controlled by corporation interests, or do you think there would still be potential for any of these things to come back?
I think there is because I think people can have an influence still. I mean, I think people are already having an influence. So the fact that now 50% of the board members are producer representatives is a recent change. Something that's happened over the past 2 or 3 years now.
You can also make a distinction between the principles and whether they're audited or not.
Yeah.
So something I've observed is they have strengthened their the content of the environmental features of the fair trade have increased, particularly in competition with Rainforest Alliance. Whether they're strictly monitored and audited in all cases is another question. So the principles are there. It's a question of capacity of monitoring, as well as what you're saying in terms of the negotiations, and that's often product by product as well.
It is. Yeah. So if you think of 2008, which is a key year, I think, 2008, 2009, when Fairtrade International was negotiating with Cadbury's, was negotiating also with Nestle, and so you can see some of the tensions. You can also see that the Rainforest Alliance and UTZ certification was growing very rapidly. So it was starting to outmuscle fair trade certification in the market. And if you look at the volumes, you can see that. And also the Rainforest Alliance are very active at farm gate, particularly in areas like East Africa. They've got a lot of people on the ground, a lot of field officers. But remember, the Rainforest Alliance don't have this and don't have this. So it's nothing to do with price. And so there are differences. I mean, that would be an interesting and some people. I think there's a paper in by Kolk from the Netherlands comparing coffee, the different certification standards. I think it's in Sustainable Development Journal in 2013. I think. Yeah. That's a very good paper because it looks at the different criteria and standards of all the different certification labels, and fair trade still clearly comes out as the strongest, despite the dilution. And so I mean, I think we've got to be. I'm giving you a kind of what's happened, but at the same time, and also I think if you're working for Fairtrade International, what my criticism is of what happened was that sometimes you don't understand the value that you've got. You don't understand your hand in the negotiation. You can be co-opted or potentially assimilated by corporations that are very, very persuasive and very, very large and powerful. And I think it's knowing the value of the hand that you've got. And so the people who work for Fairtrade International do change. The board changes, so you can nominate yourself onto the board on I think it's a biannual basis.
For Divine as a company in particular, have their standards dropped as these minimum standards have dropped?
No.
Or have they?
They continue to do pre-financing. They continue to do consumer education work. They are a true hybrid. So they do advocacy work. They do producer support work. So you could argue people have talked about Fairtrade Plus. They've talked about Fairtrade Gold. But that's difficult because who would want to sign up to Fairtrade if you're a corporation, would you want to sign up to Fairtrade Bronze if there was a Fairtrade Gold? You wouldn't, would you? I'm not sure. So those things have been discussed though in the past. So see, campaigners, if you go to a Fairtrade Fortnight campaign and look at their exhibition, you very rarely see them promoting Cadbury's Dairy Milk and Kit Kat. You really only usually see them promoting Cafe Direct and Divine and the Pioneers, because that's that's their version of fair trade that they would like to support, I think.
So just slightly following on from that, is there any, with Nestle in particular, is there any requirement for the rest of their business model to be fair trade, or can they just make a Kit Kat fair trade and then still do horrible things with baby milk, for
Yeah,
example?
completely. So fair trade certification, the Fairtrade mark, Fairtrade International, is just by product. Yeah. So if you go back to, sorry about this, if you go back to this label, the different labels. So this label is by company. Yeah, and this is just by product. And this is also by company, Ultimate Cartel then. So, so you're right. It's. I mean, you could have also negotiated that. So if you were Fairtrade International, you could have said, okay, but we expect X% of your business to go fair trade by 2012, or you could have potentially done that. But that's hasn't. I think it happened maybe in some of the cases, because you can see that Cadbury's Dairy Milk has converted gradually in different markets and converted different products. So I think that was part of kind of a loose agreement there. But yeah, sorry about that. Any questions while I'm just going on to?
Can I
Yeah.
I'm just wondering about, knowing a bit about the governance structure of Fairtrade. You're saying that the negotiations with Cadbury is partly what led to these changes in principle.
Well, allegedly.
But
Yeah.
I mean, I'm wondering what channel are they negotiating with? Fairtrade Foundation in the UK, who then goes to the Standards Committee or the board and says this is what needs to change. I mean, that's only one. They've only got access through one door. So
Yeah.
I'm wondering how they end up.
I think it
changing
depends
the
on which
standard.
company, which commodity, how global is that commodity. I don't know that bit. It would be interesting. I don't know whether you would be able to find it out. Dan, our filmmaker.
Is it fair to see it as a dilution? Because if they're entering a different sort of type of production through companies, then they're not going to need pre-financing. The question of democratic structure isn't going to apply because they're not cooperatives. You know, they're big companies employing a large workforce. So is it dilution, or is it just reflecting the change in from a cooperative, a small scale, that they were trying to get to access a market, to labelling and certifying an existing market? You know?
I think there are obviously different business models, but if you take cocoa, it is grown by smallholder farmers. So 95% of cocoa production, particularly in West Africa, is grown by smallholders. So Cadbury's would still have to buy, and Nestle still would have to buy it through smallholders. And you could argue that they have more resources than the smaller pioneers to deal with farmers directly and to implement transparency. But I think there's some challenges in the volume. So if you think of their logistics and shipping, they may find it difficult to separate out their fair trade supply from their normal supply, because they ship in very big, large containers. And but it's possible. If it's possible for the small players, I think it's also possible for the larger players. They just have to change some of their practices. Okay, so there's some literature that talks about this dilution. We're going to go to talk more about some other recent changes in the fair trade system as well. Some people have talked about this dilution as co-option and assimilation in the political kind of literature. People like Gary Gareffi, Darrell Reed have argued that, you know, you could frame this dilution in terms of co-option and assimilation. So this is an example of a label, and this is taken from the back of a pack of a supermarket own label coffee product in the United Kingdom. So this is what sometimes people are concerned about. This kind of disclaimer on the back of the pack, which you could argue is in contrast to the original pioneers. So that might provide some difficulty. And I'm going to come back to this is just a little bit about the differences in how the different markets developed in Europe, but I'm going to come back to that later because I just want to talk about some other recent developments in fair trade as well. So until recently, if something was certified fair trade, so if you were developing a chocolate product like Divine, you would, if fair trade sugar was available, fair trade vanilla, fair trade Brazil nuts, fair trade cocoa, you would have to use those in the product to get the fair trade label, to use the fair trade mark. Yeah. But that's just about, there's some new development called FSP, Fair Trade Sourcing Partnership, that's just been launched in Europe. And this is going back to Dan's point, is that corporations, you know, if you take somebody like McVitie's, might want to use fair trade cocoa in its chocolate biscuits, but doesn't necessarily want to use fair trade sugar, because of whatever reason. And some of these businesses have been asking Fairtrade International for some time now. We'd like to get involved in fair trade, but we want to get involved in it incrementally. You know, maybe look at one commodity to begin with, maybe look at 50% of our supply of one commodity. And so what's been, and this has been a 2-year consultation with Fairtrade International and suppliers, producers, is that they've come up with this new concept called Fair Trade Sourcing Partnership, FSP. And basically, to begin with, it's available to use through 3 commodities: cotton, sugar, and cocoa. And you now basically can use a single ingredient in a product, and also you don't have to buy all the ingredients. So you can say, you know, 20% of our sugar is fair trade, and you can carry this mark on the front of your pack, which is the new Fair Trade Sourcing Partnership mark, cocoa and sugar. There's also one for cotton. So if you look on the Fairtrade International website, there's Mars have just signed an agreement in Europe with Fairtrade International, just on cocoa, and they will carry this mark on the front of pack, and they'll only I think it's in the up to 2015, 50% of it's incremental year on year how it increases in terms of percentages.
Can I just say, was souring intentional?
Sorry?
Just go back to your last slide.
Yeah.
Fairtrade souring. I'm just saying, it's supposed to be sourced.
Oh yeah, sorry.
I'm just saying is that
Yeah, I got it. Yeah, no,
slip there.
it's just a slip. Sorry,
But
it wasn't meant to be that way.
Yeah.
Maybe the spell check has changed it.
But I was just, yeah.
Yeah.
You've got critical eye.
Yeah. And so this is quite controversial. It's created quite a big, hotly contested debate within the fair trade movement. So you've got some producers who are, particular Latin American producers who are not very, very happy. You've got, you know, obviously the original fair trade organisations, the FTOs like Divine and Cafe Direct, who've you know, written quite strong letters and publicised those and gone to the media. And these are their arguments. So if 2 minutes. So unfair competition. So if you think of Cafe Direct investing 60% of its operating profits in producer partnership programs, and you think of Divine, he's paying. Divine's probably a good example because it's paying fair trade sugar price, it's paying fair trade cocoa price, it's paying for fair trade price for its nuts that goes into the products, whereas some of its competitors are only paying fair trade cocoa in the product. So they're concerned that it potentially creates unfair competition. This is all available on the web, by the way, in terms of the hotly contested debate. I'm just summarising it for you. Consumer trust and confusion. So this on the front of pack, will people be able to differentiate between the fair trade mark and the FSP mark, Fair Trade Sourcing Partnership mark? There's producer objection. People are arguing it's driving down standards, affecting the credibility of fair trade, and does it compete with the fair trade mark, for example? These are some of the criticisms and some of the tensions. So I think, because I've run out of time, I think that's a good place to leave the presentation. That's just hot off the press This has only just happened in the past few months, and it's created, it's hotly contested. It's created quite a bit of debate, as you can imagine. But on the other side of the coin, it's obviously could enable Fairtrade International to catch up and increase its volumes and make it more accessible for some of the multinationals to engage and get involved in fair trade as an incremental step. So I think it's a good place to stop and open out the debate for further questions. Thank you very much, Will.
Thank you very much. So, questions?
What does it mean to be a fair trade community or fair trade town?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. The fair trade town movement started in 2001 in Garstang in Lancashire, and now there's over 1,300 fair trade towns around the world. You know, even both in the south and in the north. So there's fair trade towns in South Africa, South Korea, Brazil, blah blah blah. And you have to achieve 5 goals. So one is that you have to get a percentage of your retailers and cafes stocking and promoting fair trade. Depends on the population of the town. You have to get your local council to pass a resolution to support fair trade and procure fair trade. You have to get a couple of flagship employees in the city or a town to move and switch their procurement to fair trade. So it could be a university, it could be something like something like Asda, for example, in Leeds. You have to then get schools, colleges and universities and have a campaign for them. And you have to have an annual media campaign showing that what you're doing in terms of working with the local radio, local press, print press, and also social media. So you have to develop, and you have to do a biannual submission to the Fair Trade Foundation to maintain your status as a fair trade city or town, or a church, or a country, or a county. So Yorkshire is a fair trade county, believe it or not. And Lancashire isn't yet a fair trade county, so, but it's working on it at the moment. Good question though. Leeds is a fair trade city, I think. But that's it's an interesting research area, isn't it? This is about space, and it's now a global. I mean, this is the thing about, you know, fair trade. Its underpinnings is a social movement. Yeah, trade justice, and but fair trade towns is kind of a recent phenomenon since 2001, and you have to set up a steering committee. That's the other requirement. And the steering committee's got to be a stakeholder kind of representation of the city or the town. So you've got to have the local council on it, maybe some NGOs, there's some school representation, church representation. That's what we have in Liverpool. We meet 4 times a year, and we have a sub-action group, Fair Trade Fortnight, and they do all the events around that campaign, Fair Trade Fortnight campaign.
Yeah, I've only ever seen one town. I mean, I live in Otley, probably that's fair trade, but I have no idea.
There is one of these. Yes?
Is there any certification for tobacco? Do you know of?
I'm not aware of any. Yeah. Fair trade tobacco. Interesting. Fair trade gold. Now on the market. And none of them are aware of. Yes. You're going to share it, Will? Okay.
What, is there any evidence about the large supermarkets kind of profiteering on the back of fair trade? So they pass through not only increased cost of whatever it is they sell, but also they build in an extra premium, so you're paying 20% extra for something rather than just.
I think you have to ask the supermarkets that. I think that's what if you look at, premiumisation in supermarkets has been something that's occurred over the past 10 to 15 years, isn't it? You've got all the different ranges, and you've got, and if it was taking place in fair trade, it's not the only category that it's taking place in, but you'd have to ask the supermarket buyers that, what margins there. I mean, I obviously dealt with supermarket buyers, so I had a bit of inside information. They will put their standard margin onto fair trade products. But if the product is more expensive coming in, because the unit cost is more expensive, then obviously when you add your standard margin onto it, it's going to look as though it's more expensive, but really often it's just the standard margin that they add to it, but it does make it look more expensive.
It possibly a similar related answer.
Yeah.
In certain supermarkets, I've seen there might be bananas that are loose bananas from a particular part of the world that are fair trade, that
Yeah.
are cheaper than a packaged bunch of bananas from another part of the world, and they might be getting on for almost twice as expensive when they're packaged in a particular way. Do you think that's likely to be, presumably, when the fair trade there is a set cost that the producers will be getting?
Sure.
So do you think, I mean, you might not obviously know the answer, but would you expect that the increase in price would be due to supermarkets maybe trying to make more of a profit, or do you think it would be because of the cost of those extra, maybe if they're
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, but I must be frank. Bananas is not my area of expertise. Talk to me about tea, because things are so complicated. And I've not really looked into bananas. Tea, coffee, cocoa are my three commodities I really focus on.
I wondered if maybe if you were saying about the principles, some of the old principles are still being met, presumably there's a cost associated with those, and maybe that would drive up the price.
But that cost is borne by the individual organisations, but it wouldn't necessarily. I mean, that's the cost that they absorb and incur themselves. So Cafe Direct, that's their part of their memorandum and articles, is that they put so much percentage every year into their producer partnership program as part of their gold standard. It doesn't affect their final price.
But ultimately, if you were to buy either of those lots of bananas, the producers would still be theoretically the same.
Yeah, they get the same. I mean, because the minimum price is paid at source.
Yeah.
Has no relation to the final product. So they pay for the raw commodity. The final product in the final price in the supermarket is really down to the supplier and the company and the supermarket, not necessarily the producers. So the producers really, it's not a donatory mechanism. So the producer groups don't really care the final price in the retailer, because they should have already been paid for that particular product, at source. Nothing to do with the retail price. So it's not a donatory. I mean, that's the thing that sometimes people, particularly after, when you've got mechanisms like Comic Relief and Red Nose Day, it's not that kind of charity mechanism. It's not a donatory mechanism. The final price bears no relation to that. And there's a couple of hands up first. I'm going to get you to police yourselves in a minute. There were some hands up here. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question. I wonder, is there any progress of fair trade in China?
I'm not aware of any, although I've got lots of Chinese students that are interested in fair trade at the University of York, but I'm not aware of. I mean, it would be interesting to talk to Starbucks, I think, because if you go to South Korea, apart from some of the organisations like Beautiful South in South Korea, who are doing really well at the moment, the largest fair trade company in South Korea is Starbucks. In terms of fair trade certified sales, I'm not sure whether Starbucks are selling fair trade coffee in China, but they've got plenty of coffee shops there. But whether they're selling fair trade coffee, I don't know. I mean, if it was, it would be developed in a very different way, I think, from some of the European territories. But certainly would be. I mean, some of my students are very interested in ethical consumption. Some of my students from China, so I think there's a potential there. But I'm not aware of any. There's a question here as well. Yeah, no, I think there's two here. Yeah. Go on, do you decide between them?
How often is the minimum price revised, and do people ever pay more than it, or is it basically...
Yeah, good question. I mean, there was some criticism of Fairtrade International back in 2008, 2009, that the coffee price and the cocoa price had not been reviewed for a long time. So it was still at, for cocoa, for example, it was $1,500 US dollars per tonne. But during 2009, 2010, they were revised. So the new cocoa price is $2,000 per tonne US dollars. That was your first part of your question. Your second part was?
Do people ever pay
the price.
more?
Yeah. I mean, basically, the minimum price is as it says, is minimum. But if the world market price goes above the minimum price, which in some commodities it has done, but it's volatile, isn't it? The fair trade price will always follow it, but it will also pay that additional social premium on the top. So it's always a little bit above it by 5 to 10%.
Two questions there.
And then
Yeah, so just the two of you last
Yeah.
questions.
Thank
Yeah.
What about the traceability? I think the traceability about these products. I read a news about tea.
Yeah.
And they said that 1% of the price of the product it stay with the producers. And another question is, what's your view about what is next in this confusion? Because fair trade is now a market, no? It's a label. It's not exactly the change or consumerism or this kind of thing. What is your opinion about what next about this Rainforest and Alliance for trade? Lots of different labels.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I'll on the tea, and have you got a viewpoint on the tea, on the traceability of tea?
I think it's complicated in different countries depending on whether there's an auction or not, and so where it changes hands can affect the traceability of the product, and the issue of how much gets back to the producer is also a question of it. Do you mean the individual smallholder family as opposed to their cooperative? And sometimes, so there has been a debate about, and it's sometimes articulated by the smallholders themselves, about we want more of the price, the premium that comes back, and we have control of that rather than our cooperative. But sometimes they say that will go to community benefit, and so there's as opposed to us who are producing that benefit rather than the broader community. So there's, especially in poorer countries, I think been particularly debate in Malawi and sugar about whether it's individual farming benefit or cooperative. So it's different in different places, and it depends on the democratic decisions of those cooperatives as well, about what goes to individuals as opposed to the cooperative. And then sometimes there's levels of the cooperative as well, whether it's primary, secondary,
Or secondary.
who gets,
Particularly in tea.
who gets the division of that, and then there's what the tea factory gets. So it's different in different commodities and depends on how many tiers and who counts as the final producer.
And what's next? That's a good question. It's because there's tense. There's some trade-offs and there's a lot of tension at the moment. I think we'll see more labels, particularly more smallholder labels, and we're already seeing that. So more labels that are, maybe a more pure or stronger version of fair trade, going back to some of the original principles. I think we'll see more of that, and obviously in some of these larger, I mean, it's achieved. The fair trade label has achieved an enormous amount in a short space of time. You can't get away from that, and a lot of people said it would never work, but there's an enormous pressure on it to build scale because of the competition with the Rainforest Alliance. So they're looking at mechanisms to build scale while maintaining that kind of relationship with smallholder farmers and producing producer impact. So I think, and I think having producers on the board, 50% representation is really good, because it's not always what we as consumers think. It's what the producer, has the biggest impact on the producers, and that's really why fair trade was originally created, was to alleviate, was to change the trading relationship, to change the way that world trade works. So I think it's up for debate, I think, for sure. Yes, sorry,
Mine's related, really. You said that one of the aims of this new mark here is that the big buyers might incrementally buy more, but what possible motivation could they have if they get the glory or the usefulness of that mark? What pressure on them is there to
and also I agree, and also there was a strong lobby within the movement for that label to be on the back of pack rather than being on the front of pack, but it's actually going to be on the front of pack. I completely agree with you. I think I would be also have reservations about that. maybe it's a part of a learning process. I don't know. I was struggling. I mean, I originally thought it wasn't. It was a reasonable idea if it occurred on the back of the pack, and the next step was to go for full labelling, which would occur on the front of the pack. Because if you look at that, the label, and you look at the fair trade mark, you can see why consumers might not even differentiate between the two of them, because they're the same, similar colours. It's a paler colour, but is the consumer that discerning, given the split-second decision in the supermarket to buy, these type of products?
Also, that one says fair trade, whereas the other sometimes you just see the logo.
Yeah.
Okay, so last question then.
Yeah,
This is our filmmaker again.
I'm just interested in this transition from the sort of producer cooperatives gaining access to a market via Fairtrade to Fairtrade being a certificate applied to existing companies that employ like a workforce. So two questions. I mean, with the expansion of Fairtrade, how many of the producers are actually wage earners rather than small farmers? And in terms of the wage earners, has Fairtrade made a difference to wage levels?
I don't. The first part of your question was about numbers. Just repeat it again. I'm not quite. It's probably data that's not available. You remember you're dealing with rural cooperatives, rural farmers. Go on, Anne.
The Fairtrade International last monitoring statement does break that down by country. The number of Fairtrade hired workers versus members of cooperatives. So that data is available. It's highly variable. East Africa has probably even workers versus cooperatives. Central America is mostly cooperatives, and then it changes by commodity. So it's 100% cooperatives in cocoa, coffee. To the one, what's the other one? It's the third one. I can't remember what it is.
It certainly is in cocoa.
But in sugar, it's plantations and cooperatives in sugar, bananas. Only plantations in flowers. So it's varies.
Yeah.
It's so variable by commodity.
But the thing about cocoa is that it's mostly smallholder crop, you see. So it's not that's the system of production, and so you have to deal with smallholders as part of the supply chain. Whereas in other commodities, it's different, isn't it?
There are different forms of production.
Okay. So it depends on the commodity and the country.
So I mean, the main question really was its impact on wage levels.
Again, it differs from. I mean, one of the things about fair trade, when you go and visit fair trade cooperatives, the people who've been involved in the fair trade system, and you listen to the people who come over here for Fair Trade Fortnight, and you hear their stories, you're blown away by the impact of fair trade. But to actually go into some of these rural areas and find out that kind of level of detail, it's a large-scale research project, and I'm not sure anybody's done it. So
I think we're going to have to finish there because we're out of time.
Yeah.
So thanks to Bob and thanks to you all. To give another
thank you.